Hello, guys, and happy July 4th. Today we're going to be talking about the most American of all of the scriptures, the Book of Mormon, a testament of Jesus Christ that was primarily written here somewhere in the New World. We don't know exactly where it took place. It could have taken anywhere from Alaska to Chile or anywhere in between. There's a lot of debate and a lot of heated conversation in the church about where exactly the Book of Mormon took place, but that is not going to be the topic of this video. Today we're going to be talking about how the Book of Mormon was actually translated. Now, I've created a fairly neutral slideshow here, but understand, I think it's pretty hard to deny that the Book of Mormon, at the very least, is a very mysterious document. If it did not come about the way Joseph Smith said it came about, there's not a whole lot of explanation. There's not a whole lot of good explanations outside of that. So today we're going to be looking at, again, a fairly neutral take on the translation process, going through what Joseph Smith said, and we'll be looking at his claims. So let's go over the cold hard facts. Joseph Smith said that he translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. He did not present the work as a normal academic translation based on years of language study, but as a revelatory process. The main translation period took place in 1829, and the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. The exact mechanics are still discussed, but the basic historical sources agree that Joseph dictated the text to scribes. This is something very important. The Book of Mormon is a very complicated document with a lot of interweaving storylines, flashbacks within flashbacks. It's a very complicated book, much like the Bible. Now, in order to just write something like that, usually it's going to take years of note-taking, brainstorming, multiple drafts. There is no record of any of that happening with the Book of Mormon. It was orated by Joseph Smith to scribes one time, and that was it. There was no first draft, second draft. There was no study involved. It is something that Joseph Smith simply read aloud to whoever was writing down the text. That is not just the consensus of the church. That is the consensus of most academics who look at the story, members of the church or not. Now, what was Joseph Smith's claim? Joseph Smith gave only limited explanation of how the translation worked. When asked about the process, he usually emphasized that it was done through divine power rather than giving a step-by-step description. This matters because later accounts fill in details that Joseph himself did not always explain publicly. A careful approach has to separate Joseph's own claims from later memories, artwork, assumptions, and traditions. So, here's how Joseph Smith said it worked. He said he translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. He was shown the location of the brass plates by the angel Moroni, and then he received the plates and translated it basically over the course of, I think it's just about a month or two. He did not spend a long time translating the Book of Mormon. Now, again, it's a very fantastical story. I think we can all agree it's even a little crazy, but all sorts of crazy things end up being true. So that doesn't necessarily discount the text. Discount the text. Now, according to Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon came from ancient gold plates delivered by the angel Moroni. Now, sorry, a little bit of a typo there. They were probably made out of brass and probably not made of actual gold, but they're often called the gold plates because, of course, they were gold in appearance. The plates were said to contain a sacred record written by ancient prophets. The plates were central to the story, even though they were not always visible during dictation. Several witnesses later testified that they saw or handled the plates, which became an important part of early Latter-day Saint testimony. It is worth stating that we have more eyewitnesses to the existence of the brass plates than we do to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In modern Christian apologetics, often the eyewitness accounts of the resurrection are cited as proof that the resurrection actually happened, because, of course, those eyewitnesses put their lives at risk and in most cases did die bearing testimony of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I actually do find that pretty convincing. But if we're going to say that is convincing, we cannot hold that same standard and say that the witnesses to the brass plates were lying. All of the people who saw the brass plates took it to their grave, that they really existed, that they handled them, that on these plates were characters of mysterious origin. All of them testified of that, and 3 of those witnesses saw an angel. And even after they left the church, they took the testimony to their graves that the plates were physically real and that the Book of Mormon was truly of divine origin. So it's just so interesting, right? Because the Christian world, a lot of them want to hold this one standard, which says the eyewitness to the resurrection is credible, which I would agree. But then, we take these other witnesses to the Book of Mormon and suddenly we have to ignore them. It's kind of interesting. There's a double standard there, right? So I'll just leave you with that. Now, as far as the instruments, now Joseph Smith always said it was by the gift and power of God, but we know that there were tools involved. Historical sources describe more than one instrument connected with the translation. Joseph received interpreters with the plates, sometimes described as 2 sets of stones in a frame, and he also used a separate seer stone. Now, that seer stone was something that he found much earlier in his life. And what's funny is this is not something unique to Joseph Smith. It was actually really popular in that region of America. There was this thing called Christian mysticism, which was sort of like this folk magic. If you're familiar with divining rods, that's a part of that. And it's weird because divining rods actually work. I digress. But Joseph Smith had the seer stone, which he claimed could be used to find hidden artifacts. Now, what's funny is people would hire him to look for artifacts on their land. And occasionally Joseph Smith would be like, hey, I don't know if this will work. And then they would insist on hiring him anyway and figuring it out. To my knowledge, Joseph Smith never actually did find any treasure, although there's conflicting accounts with that. The language can get confusing because early saints sometimes use the term Urim and Thummim broadly, depending on the source. That phrase may refer to the Nephite interpreters, the seer stone, or translation instruments in general. To my knowledge, it's actually only the seer stone itself that was referred to as the Urim and Thummim. The Jaredite interpreters, the 2 sets of stones in a frame, to my knowledge, those were only ever called the interpreters. Now, what's weird about Urim and Thummim is I believe it's a word that translates better to light and darkness or something like that. It is a word that we find in the Old Testament, and it's a word that we find in the book of Revelation. And it's this instrument that is associated with divination, the ability to have a physical object to determine God's will. Now, this is not something that is alien to readers of the Bible. They draw straws to figure out whether or not to throw Jonah out of a boat. David uses a looking glass, a looking cup to perceive the word of God. The Urim and Thummim were these rocks that would be thrown on the ground in the Old Testament to try and figure out God's will. The idea that you would use a physical instrument to figure out the will of God, this is not something that is alien to readers of the Bible. Now, to those who might not know what they're talking about, this might be perceived as some kind of form of witchcraft or something like that. But to those of us that have actually read the biblical text, God is more than willing to use whatever he wants to communicate with us. He can appear to us face to face. He can talk to us in our dreams. He can answer our prayers in diverse ways. And sometimes he'll send people that'll function as angels to carry out his will. And every now and then he'll use a physical instrument. God is going to do whatever he wants and use whatever tools he wishes to accomplish his goals and designs. So as a Christian, I don't see any problem with Joseph Smith allegedly using some of these instruments to translate the Book of Mormon. It should be said that after the Book of Mormon was translated, Joseph Smith did claim to translate further texts that was supposed to be part of the Bible, adventures about Abraham, which we'll get to in the next episode of this podcast. But after this, Joseph Smith said he did not need the tools anymore, that he had sufficient, practice or training to translate without them. So kind of interesting. Let's move on. Now, this is where it gets fun. Several eyewitnesses said Joseph placed a seer stone into a hat and looked into it to block out light while dictating. This detail is now openly discussed in church publications, even though older church art often showed a different image. For some members, the hat and seer stone feel surprising because they were not always emphasized. Historically, though, they are part of the documentary record and appear in multiple accounts of the translation. Now, I have personally met members of the church who really struggled when they learned that Joseph Smith put a rock in a hat. Now, it should be said that it's actually not known. It seems likely that this happened, but we actually don't have any proof that this is what happened. It's not the consensus, from what I understand. But let's just say he did. So you're telling me that you're cool with the story of an ancient American prophet of Jewish descent appearing to Joseph Smith, leading him to a mound in the woods near his home, where some gold plates and a stone box were buried around 400 AD. Joseph Smith then takes this record having no formal education of any kind, translates this beautiful book with seemingly no contradictions, no logical errors, and doctrine that is consistent and reinforces what we already read in the Bible. And he only does that in a few days. You're okay with that whole story. But the second you find out Joseph Smith put a rock in a hat, now we have a problem? Now you have questions? Now we have suspicions? It's like, my questions start way before we put the rock in the hat. In fact, this actually makes the story make more sense. Think about it. If Joseph Smith has this rock, and on this rock he can see the English version of the Book of Mormon, and he is reading what he is, he is saying out loud what he's reading on the stone. Well, let's say it's a little bright outside. Doesn't it make sense that to make it easier to see, he would put the rock in a hat? Something that blocks out the light so he can see what's on the stone better? We have all done this. Except not with the seer stone, but with our phones. Have you ever been on the beach or you've been outside on a really bright sunny day and you can't quite see your phone screen? What do? You put it in a hat, you put it in a shirt, you shade it with your hand, right? You make it so that it's easier to see on the screen. So this is something that might have been really challenging for a member of the church in 1940 to learn about. But for those of us who have our own sort of lesser, lower law versions of a seer stone, the iPhone, the Android, whatever, this is actually something that makes a ton of sense. So I just think that's such a fascinating detail that totally lines up with some kind of strange God technology. I believe, yes, the story is strange, but this is something that does follow. If you believe what's going on with the seer stone, this actually makes the story make more sense, not less. So I just think that's such a fascinating detail. And this is not something that should challenge the faith of anyone in the church. This is something that totally logically follows. If you have questions, you should start with the angel, not with the rock. But anyway, I digress. Now, this is where it gets interesting. One major question is what role the plates played if Joseph sometimes dictated without directly looking at them. A lot of members of the church don't know this, but the Book of Mormon remained, from what I can tell, basically completely covered throughout the entire translation. As far as we can tell, there was no point when Joseph Smith pulled out the gold plates and looked at them directly. The most careful answer is that the plates were the ancient source record while the translation came through revelation. This does not make the plates unimportant. In the historical narrative, they anchor the Book of Mormon to a physical world, while the translation instruments explain how Joseph believed the words were revealed. Oftentimes, the Book of Mormon wouldn't even be in the room, so it's kind of interesting. The plates were always relatively nearby, but sometimes they were not even in the room while Joseph was translating them. Now, I think something that we have to, contend with as members of the church, a lot of members of the church, they will say that the Book of Mormon, maybe it didn't really take place. Like maybe this was some kind of divine allegory, kind of like the Book of Job. How, it's consensus that the Book of Job probably didn't literally happen, but it's a metaphor and it's a divine tale, I guess, a divine allegory. It's a divine parable. Because Jesus told a lot of parables. It's not stuff that actually happened, but it's stories that can teach us things about the gospel. A lot of members of the church, to explain the lack of archaeological evidence, will say that the Book of Mormon might be some kind of divine parable. Now, brothers and sisters, this just simply cannot be the case if the Book of Mormon was an actual artifact. If the only thing real about the Book of Mormon is the brass plates, that brings up a lot of it's kind of confusing and it's very interesting. We have to understand that archaeology in the New World, both North and South America, is very far behind archaeology in the Old World. They've been doing archaeology in the Old World before America even became colonized. America is very far behind, and during the process of Manifest Destiny, a lot of ancient burial grounds, burial mounds, a lot of these things were plowed over and turned into fields. A lot of this history was destroyed. And before that, a lot of it was destroyed by the conquistadors, who famously burned down the Aztec and Mayan libraries. So the fact that we don't have the city of Zarahemla in the archaeological record, or we don't have a Nephi artifact in the archaeological record, that's okay. Archaeology is very underfunded, And it's very far behind of where anyone would want it to be. Go ask an archaeologist. There's still so much work to do in North, Central, and South America with archaeology. There is plenty of room for the locations of the Book of Mormon to be found. And by the way, when they find a sword in the ground, it's not labeled with what civilization was using that sword. For all we know, the museums in our country are loaded with Nephite and Lamanite artifacts, and we just have no idea. A lot of times when they're naming a people, like the Hopewell people or the Olmecs, these are not what those civilizations called themselves. We call them that because that's the best name we can give them. We have no idea what many of these civilizations called themselves. There is still so much we don't know about American history. There is plenty of room for the Book of Mormon to still be in there. So do not panic. Do not freak out because you go to the Smithsonian and there's no Lamanite exhibit. It's really, honestly, if you understand the context of where archaeology is in the New World, it's really not a big deal. So no, I think this idea that the Book of Mormon is some kind of divine parable, I think it needs to be put to rest. The Book of Mormon absolutely historically happened, or at least if you believe in the Book of Mormon and if you believe in the claims of Joseph Smith, you kind of have to believe the Book of Mormon was real and the Book of Mormon literally happened. Joseph did not write most of the Book of Mormon manuscript himself, meaning write it down. Emma Smith, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery, and others acted as scribes, writing down the words as Joseph dictated them. Their role is important because it gives historians multiple witnesses to the process. Some scribes later remembered Joseph dictating for long periods without books, notes, or manuscripts in front of him. In fact, we think Joseph Smith might have had possession of a Bible, but we actually technically don't have any proof that he did. Again, Joseph Smith did this whole thing freestyle in one take without any notes. Now, that might not sound impressive unless you've read the Book of Mormon. If you have read the Book of Mormon, especially in Mosiah and Alma, where we're dealing with flashbacks within flashbacks, when we're dealing with very complex stories, with different characters, with prophecies at the beginning that aren't fulfilled until the end, and prophecies in the middle that are fulfilled throughout the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon is so wildly interconnected and very complicated and frankly very beautiful. And so the idea that one guy who was probably very intelligent but not very well educated at all, Joseph Smith, the idea that he just freestyled this whole thing without any notes in one take, and the fact that the idea that he just did that on his own, I think that's hilarious. In fact, I think a lot of Christians now, they're learning about the complexities of the Book of Mormon. And those who do not convert to the church, a lot of them have to say that the Book of Mormon is demonic because they acknowledge that it's too complex for Joseph Smith and even his team of people to create. There had to be some kind of divine element. When they say, well, it can't be from Jesus because Mormonism's evil, so it has to be from the devil. And I actually have a lot more respect for that position because that position makes a lot more sense. And so then the question has to be asked, well, if the devil wrote the Book of Mormon, what does the Book of Mormon say? Why would the Book of Mormon say that Jesus Christ is the eternal God and the eternal Father if the devil wrote it? Does that make any sense at all? So anyway, as far as the scribes, again, it should be said that none of these people had education sufficient to write the Book of Mormon. Some of these men were pretty well educated, like Oliver Cowdery, for example. But the idea that they had the background to, again, forge the Book of Mormon with Joseph, I just think is preposterous. And all of these people went to their grave saying that the Book of Mormon was divine. Even after they left the church, where they had no incentive to make Joseph Smith look good, even after they were angry with him, after they hated him, after they fought with him, they still said the Book of Mormon was a legitimate translation. So, again, just so beautiful. Now, this is a fun story. Before the current Book of Mormon text was completed, Martin Harris borrowed an early manuscript to show family members. Those pages were lost, creating a major crisis for Joseph Smith. Joseph later said God instructed him not to retranslate the missing pages. Instead, he translated the small plates of Nephi, which covered similar spiritual ground from a different record. Now, what's cool about this is in the Book of Mormon, Nephi is saying, I'm telling you a bunch of stuff my dad already wrote, and I don't know why I'm writing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So it's just kind of funny how the Book of Mormon God, knowing everything, kind of anticipated that this would happen. And so he had Nephi write everything that his dad wrote down. And it's a real shame that we don't have the Lost 116. I think it'd be really fun if the church was somehow able to recover these. I don't know whatever happened to them. But it would be pretty great if the church was able to get them back. What's funny about this is you can actually see in the Book of Mormon where the 116 pages went missing. Between the book Words of Mormon and Mosiah, Words of Mormon talks about King Benjamin and how great he was and all of his wars. And if you read Mosiah chapter 1, it opens up with King Benjamin just wrapping up a battle. It begins in the middle of a story. So you can tell, like, there was a cutoff there where we are missing like 2 or 3 chapters of the Book of Mosiah. So it's just kind of interesting. If you have a Book of Mormon, go look at it yourself. It's fascinating. Now, most of the Book of Mormon, as we now have it, was dictated in a relatively short period in 1829, especially after Oliver Cowdery became Joseph's main scribe. Supporters see the speed and consistency of the dictation as evidence of divine help. Historians focus on the surviving manuscripts, the timeline, and the eyewitness accounts to understand what can and cannot be known. And again, I've said it a few times in this podcast, but if the Book of Mormon did not come about the way Joseph Smith said it did, how did it come about exactly? And to this day, there's still no good explanation. They'll attack the Book of Abraham, they'll attack polygamy, they'll attack all these other things, and whatever. There's a conversation to be had there. But like Jeffrey R. Holland said, if you want to attack the church, if you want an excuse to not join, or if you want an excuse to leave, you have to do it while ignoring the Book of Mormon. And here's what's great about the Book of Mormon. If the Book of Mormon is literally true, good news. That means the Bible's basically literally correct. That means Jesus Christ is God. It confirms everything about Christianity. That's why I'm grateful for the Book of Mormon personally. But again, there's just really no consensus outside of the primary story. Eyewitness accounts do not all describe every detail the same way, but they share several important themes. Joseph dictated aloud, scribes wrote his words, and the process was understood by participants as sacred rather than ordinary. Emma Smith, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and others describe Joseph using translation instruments and not relying on books or notes. Their accounts are important even when historians treat later memories carefully. After dictation, a printer's manuscript was prepared from the original manuscript. The Book of Mormon was then printed in Palmyra, New York, and published in March 1830. Later editions corrected spelling, punctuation, and grammar. These changes are important, but they were mostly editorial rather than a complete writing of the book's narrative or message. This is something that I heard a lot on my mission. People would say, well, did you know the Book of Mormon you have today is different than the original Book of Mormon printer's manuscript? And the answer is yes. You can go to Deseret Book right now and you can buy a clone of the original Book of Mormon. And here's what you're going to find. You're not going to find any verses. I think they have chapters. I could be wrong about that. But you're not going to find any verses. And the phrase, "and it came to pass," is going to be in there like 10 times more than it is in the current Book of Mormon. And so to make it make more sense in English, yes, they took out all of "and it came to passes." They added verses to, of course, make it easier to study and reference, kind of like they did with the Bible, right? But here's another interesting thing. I think it's in the ancient Mayan script. The phrase "and it came to pass" is also extremely common, which I find very interesting. It's also a very common phrase all over the Middle East, all over the Levant. The phrase "and it came to pass" is very common. It's very common in the Bible. Mark Twain criticized the Book of Mormon. He said something along the lines of, if you took out "and it came to pass," it would only be a few pages long. So, which I think is kind of a funny criticism. But yeah, they did end up editing the Book of Mormon to make more sense in English in that sense. But I mean, they kind of, the way the critics of the Book of Mormon put it, they want you to believe that the Book of Mormon changed in some dramatic way. Basically, they just corrected all the grammatical errors. I mean, and they corrected the spelling errors. They didn't change the content of the book itself. I mean, it'd be kind of like saying the New International Version is completely different than the original version of the Bible. It's like, well, I mean, it is and it isn't. It's a translation into English. So, I mean, of course, it's going to not read the same as Hebrew or Greek. But it is going to be a translation. That's just how translations work. So anyway, I just think it's kind of a dumb criticism. Modern church publications acknowledge both the Nephite interpreters and the seer stone. They also acknowledge that Joseph Smith sometimes used the seer stone in a hat while dictating. This is a shift from simplified picture many members grew up with, but it is not a rejection of the translation story. The church now presents a fuller historical picture while still emphasizing divine revelation. And it's true. In a lot of church artwork and a lot of church videos, Joseph Smith would be sitting there with the golden plates out, and he's got the interpreters, and he's looking at them. And listen, those movies were fun, and they're fine educational tools, but it is not an accurate depiction of how this went down. In a lot of newer church media, this is something that is fixed and has been corrected. But yeah, I mean, you can still go to some church houses and you'll see a painting of Joseph Smith with the Book of Mormon out in its full glory on the table. And that's just not how it went down at all. A historical approach can describe witnesses, manuscripts, instruments, timelines, and later accounts. It can show what sources say and where the evidence is clear or uncertain. A faith approach adds the claim that God revealed the text through Joseph Smith. The two approaches ask different questions, but both benefit from honesty about the historical record. So I'll just end with this, guys. If you have a better theory for how Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, put it in the comments. Sure, there's some chapters from Isaiah. Sure, the Sermon on the Mount shows up in 3rd Nephi. Okay, there's some themes that are interesting and correlate to the time that Joseph Smith was growing up in during the Second Great Awakening. I mean, there's little things that you can throw at the Book of Mormon, but there's no complete explanation. Unlike the Quran, which I don't want to disparage Islam, I think it's a great religion, it's a beautiful religion. I have nothing but respect for Islam. But scholars have a handle on how the Quran was formulated. They just do. The same cannot be said about the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon, I don't think there's a better story than what Joseph Smith said. I think Joseph Smith's story is pretty unbelievable. But there's no alternative. Have a wonderful day.